Hello and welcome. In this video, I am going to do another of these app put together kind of videos where together we can build an actual app. So not just showing off a particular feature or showing you how to use a set of controls. This is actually going to walk you through putting together an app. And so here is a demonstration of the app that we'll be putting together over the next couple of videos. And so it's basically just like a simple little to-do app. Right down at the bottom here, we can enter in items into our list, and just like a simple to-do app, we'll have a list of items that we will keep in our app, and then down at the bottom, a little input for us to be able to add new items to that list. We'll be able to check them off as they're completed. So as we use these check boxes over here on the side, then you'll be able to say, hey, are you done with this item? And if so, we'll clear it out of the list. And we're going to use some features of persistence and use the shared preferences to actually store our list data. So as I create a new item, then I'll be able to add that to the list. So I'm going to get started in a blank Android project here for Xamarin. And so I have my main activity up, and then I have just our blank to-do list area that we'll be working with. So a couple of things just to get us started. I'm going to hop over to the main activity. And since we're going to be using a list with this, I'm going to change this to a list activity. And we can change our label up here. So like I'd like to make this like my to-do list. Right? We can set up if we want the icon, and then one of the main feature items that we want to do, we'll also add up here, but that can wait. I'll show you that in a second. A couple of using statements that we're going to want to put into our application. Since I don't want to use a basic array, I actually want to use a C# list. We're going to need using system.collections generic for that, and then a couple of other things, a couple of other using statements that we'll need to add in. We're going to need Android content and also Android views. And I'll point out when we start using those classes, but I like to just go ahead and knock these using statements out of the way if I know I'm going to be using those kinds of features. Okay, so we're going to get started by setting up our UI. So come on over to our main area here, and I'm going to get our toolbox and properties windows out. So we're going to use a ListView control that is going to take up a very large portion of our screen because for the most part our items that we are holding in our to-do application are going to be held in this list view. And we want this list view to work with, remember I changed this to a list activity, we have to change the ID of that list view. Instead of an @ ID, we need @Android ID, and then I'm just going to call it list. And that's because when the system itself is accessing this list view, it uses it by this Android ID property. So @Android:ID and then / what we want to name it. I named it list. And then in order to get this layout the way that I want it, I am going to use a table row kind of layout. So we'll find over here a table row under our layout section, and we'll go ahead and put this at the bottom. Now we're going to have to move our list around, so we can use it using the little sliders here. We can move this around. And if you have trouble getting your items where they're supposed to be, you can always flip over to the source tab at the bottom and do it in the source view. Right? So we can see that we have our list view, and then we have a table row. And what I'm doing with that table row is I'm actually going to use that to hold a couple of items, because it's really hard to get them side by side the way that we want them when we want to add items in. And so in order to have an area down here at the bottom where I can type and collect the data about the item I want to add to the list, I'm going to use this table row. So I need a edit view, that's what or an edit text. and that's what we're going to use to type. So let's see, what kind do I want? Probably just a basic plain text is fine. So we'll put that in that row. You can see as I drag this over the UI, that row is lighting up for me. So I can drop that in there. And I don't want it to be the entire width because I also want to put the submit button out here to the side. But let's go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to name it item text. And like I said, we're going to need a button. So as the user types in this box what they want to add to the list, then we'll give them a little button here, and we'll put that in there. So you can see that button sits nicely next to that. We're going to change it to the add button. And I'm just going to change the text in here to say add. And there's a couple of other layout things that you could do, like if you don't like that this sits so close to the edges and stuff, you can come in and change that. Like I like to select that row, and then we can come into our view group, and like our layout margin on the left, we could do like 2 pixels, right? And that'll help move things over just a tad. So feel free to think about, if you don't like that this button sits so close to the box, if you want to make this box a little bigger, you could scoot that over. Once you start testing it on your device, you'll be able to see how this layout is working for you. I could probably bring this down a little bit further. I do know on because I test this on a Nexus 4, that if I get too close to this bottom edge down here, even though I'm using a Nexus 4 device preview, that it will cut things off because it doesn't quite judge the size of the window correctly for me. So we'll want to make sure that that is set up correctly. All right, so that is pretty much it for our UI considerations. This is a single activity, single view application. So, and I showed you that preview at the beginning, but basically what we want to do is the user types things in here, they click add, and it will add it to our list up here. Now, we will need to make a change to this list because as you saw in the little demo, we had the checkboxes out to the side. So we want the user to be able to select those checkboxes, and then if they've checked it, then we'll say, hey, are you done with this item? If so, we'll go ahead and clear it out and kind of saying, hey, it's done because this is a to-do list. All right, so the only thing I really need to do here to this list view is we need to go to our main section here. And under the smooth scroll bar, you could go ahead and turn that on so that if you have enough items in your list that you need a scroll bar, the smooth scrolling works well. And then choice mode, we're going to want to select multiple choice. And then once we set up the actual list, we'll be able to tell it that we want the mode to use the checkboxes. But this is what will allow us to select more than one item at a time. Okay, so at this point, we haven't really written any code, but you go ahead and give it a build, make sure it saves. We didn't do anything weird and the build doesn't work. If you want to go ahead and deploy to your device so that you can check out how it looks, of course, you can always make changes to the UI later as we progress and you actually have items in your list. But of course, you can always do this at any time. Go ahead and deploy it by making sure that your device is connected, clicking the Run button up here. I think earlier I said this was a Nexus 4. It's obviously a Nexus 5. And just looking at your UI layout and see if that works for you. Okay, so let's get hopping over into some code. Come over to your main activity, and you can get some of these windows out of your way. So we already set this up to be a list activity. Like I said, this will be a single activity application. We won't need to do anything with separate windows or anything like that. I am going to go ahead and set up some class level items here that we're going to need. So the first thing is we're going to need a list to hold the items that are ultimately going to populate our list. This list is also what we will be using to store the data. Remember, I said this is going to be a persistent application. Every time the user opens that application, they should see the items that are still in their list. So I'm going to set up a public list of type string named items and just a basic get and set initializer. And then we're also going to need an array adapter. So An array adapter is how we connect data to things like list views. So array adapter, again type string, I'm just going to name it adapter. And then finally, we're going to set up our shared preferences file. This is where that data will be stored persistently. So if you've not used the shared preferences before, you can go back to some previous videos that I've done on this that show you how to store that information. Remember, a shared preference file is private to the device through the iShared Preferences interface is how we access that. And what we're doing here with this line is we're telling the system, hey, we're going to use shared preferences. I'm going to need a file created. I'm naming it ToDo data. And we need a file creation mode. We're going to make it private so that no other apps on the device could access this. So our data is kind of safe. So we'll be able to access our shared preferences through this iShared Preferences instance. And the ToDo data is basically the file where these key value pairs will be stored. Okay, so let's come on down to the onCreate section. So let's just walk through some basic things. First, you'll want your set content view, so go ahead and uncomment that line. But let's just talk about some of the logic that goes into this process. So when we're working with a list view, and if you've watched some of my tutorial videos on using list views and adapters and things before, then you kind of know these steps. So the first thing you do, we have a list of items. We're going to initialize the list. And I'm just going to comment this up real quick so we can talk about logic before I get into code. So we're going to initialize the list. We're going to load in any existing list items from shared preferences. We are going to add the list of items to the list view. And then we can, at that point, the list items are loaded, and then we'll move on to getting clicks from the add button and handling those things. So that'll be next. Okay, so this is basically our process here for when the app loads. How do we show the existing items in the list? All right, so the first thing we have to do, we have to initialize our list. We have our public list of type string. It is named items, so we have to go ahead and initialize that. We just need to say items equals a new list of type string, right? So that we have an instance of the object in memory prepared for us to put items in. Okay, loading any existing items from shared preferences. We're actually going to set up a method that does this and populates our list. So I'm going to jump over that for a second. Let's come down to our list of items in the list view. We need to go ahead and initialize that adapter, the array adapter that we set up here. So we have our adapter. It is a new array adapter of type string. And when we call its constructor, we get a bunch of different options. The first one is the context. Well, the context is this activity that we're in right now, so we just use this. And then this is where we get to choose the type of list that we're going to use. So Android resource layout, can't type. Type of list. Well, we want a simple list item. You know, you get a bunch of different ones. Expandables, galleries. We want a simple list item, multiple choice. And that's what will give us those nice checkboxes. And then what are we populating it with? What is the items that are ultimately going into this list? It is items, our list that we just initialized up above. And then we just take our list adapter and equal it to our adapter that we have set up here. Right? List adapter is that built-in system list adapter that you get when your activity is of type list activity. Again, if you need to go back and look at the tutorials on that, you can check that out. All right, so loading in the existing items from shared preferences. I'm going to set up a separate method for this because it's actually quite chunky in terms of code, and I don't want my onCreate to end up being like 100 lines. So let's come down here and start a new method. So and that's basically what this is going to do. We're going to load in the items from shared preferences, if any, and populate our list. Have I got this in the wrong spot? Yep. Need to be on the other side of this curly brace. There we go. Still in the class. That's where we need to go. So sorry. Sometimes I like to do this so you know where your curly braces are. Totally up to you. Okay, so what are we doing in this method? We are loading in items from shared preferences. So first, we need to find out how many items we have in shared preferences. And if you've never used shared preferences before, this can be kind of tricky because it's not like storing items in a list or an array where we can count them, or we have like a built-in count property that we can access. Shared preferences is literally a file of key value pairs, and it's not a very smart animal in that we don't have any way to tell how many items are inside of it. And so one of the dangers of using shared preferences is that if you have lost the names of your keys, you no longer have access to your values. I know, terrible. So one of the key value pairs we're going to store inside of our shared preferences file is literally the number of items we need to be looking for inside of our shared preferences file. And we're going to use what we'll call the item count key to find out. And so we will create a key inside called item count that will tell us how many items are inside. So we'll set up a counter, getting from, remember, prefs was our shared preferences file or object instance. Get int, we're looking for a key named item count, and if there isn't anything in item count, we'll default it to 0. Now, I know right now we haven't created this and put anything in it, so it's always going to default to 0, but the first time we save items is when we'll be able to update that key. All right, next we're going to loop through the number of items we should have, and we can add those items to our list. So as we get each key value pair in, I'm going to put shared preferences, SP, hiccups. In SP, we will add them to the items list. So if our count is greater than 0, we know we've got items to loop through. And if you want to check, just, you can always add in something like a toast to kind of give your user a, hey, heads up, we're getting saved items. And that toast notification is just, so your users can kind of get an update. But you can also see when that toast fires that this method is actually, happening. Okay, so the actual logic of looping through and getting our items out of shared preferences, again, because you don't know, unless you know how you named them, which keys are in there, you basically have to work out some logic for how you're going to get the items to the list, or out of the shared preferences and into the list. So I'm just going to do a basic for loop here. So I equals 0, and while we are less than or equal to our count value, increment our I. And so this is where naming your keys and items that you have in shared preferences is super important. And so One of the things that I like to do when we're storing data like this, in this case where it's just like to-do data, if you're storing shared preferences about your actual app, then you know absolutely what you name them. But our naming scheme kind of needs to be dynamic based on the items that we're putting in our list. So I just like to use a numeric key value based on how many items we have in the list. So the first item in the list will be key item 1, whatever its value is. The next item will be key value 2, et cetera, et cetera. So when I'm looping through something like this, I can get out my string item from prefs.getString. We know we're storing them as a string. We can get them as a string. And so if my key value to identify is whatever numerically item it is in the list, then I'm going to use i.toString, right? Because we're looping through each one of those items. And if it doesn't get one, it'll be null. And so starting at 0, we'll get whichever key is 0, and then increment, we'll get whatever key is 1, etc., until we get all of the items. And if we have an item, right, that's not equal to null, don't want null items in our list, then we'll do an items.add and put it in there. Now, I could have went through and commented that all up, but I really just kind of wanted to explain it to you as we went. So this will get our items out of shared preferences and where they belong, putting them into our items list, which ultimately we set up here is the basis for our adapter. And so we'll just call our load list method right here. Okay, so now that we have this all set up, remember I said we're ready to start getting clicks from the add button, and so we can go ahead and get our add button set up. Right, so we create an instance of our button, and we find view by ID. And then we can set up our click handler delegate. Okay, so again, let's just walk through some of the logic that we have here. And I always like to place this semicolon here just so it'll stop yelling. So what do we want to do in this click event? Well, so this is the button that when our user types something in our box here, they click add, and then we take whatever item they've typed in here and we've added it to our list. Okay, so we're going to want to get our edit text box and take the string item out of it. We're going to actually check and make sure we have a non-null item to add. So they didn't just hit the add button with a blank field. We're going to need to add this new item to our main list of items. And we're also going to need to add this new item to our adapter list so that it gets populated into the actual list view. We're going to have to let the list view know. Oops. The adapter list has changed. This will let the we'll let the adapter, or we'll tell the list view that the adapter list has changed, and that'll cause the UI to refresh. We're going to need to clear out the text box for new entry, and then we're going to update the stored key value pairs in shared preferences. So that is everything that will be taking place in our button click code. Of course, that's not the end of our app. We'll also need to set up our onListItem click event. So what happens when we actually click on one of those items in the list? And we'll also need to look at how this update process is going to work for shared preferences. So this is the end of our part one. I know we don't really have a working app yet, but you can start playing with your UI and your controls and start thinking about some of the things that you might want to do to a to-do kind of list app. And we'll pick up with part 2 and start fleshing out this button code that we've kind of logically laid out here and starting to see our app take shape. So stay tuned for part 2. And if you need the source code for this app, of course you can always get it off the GitHub, but I think you'll learn a whole lot more by writing it yourself. So to give it a shot and make an attempt. And of course, I'm always available for questions. Feel free to leave comments or post on the channel. Thanks.